The night shift at Oakwood Memorial Hospital always felt different. As a nurse for 15 years, I'd grown accustomed to the eerie quiet that settled over the building after sunset. But something about this particular wing made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the flickering fluorescent lights that maintenance never seemed to fix, or the way sound echoed differently through these older corridors. Whatever it was, my gut had been warning me about this place since they reassigned me here 3 months ago. It started with small things. Patient charts that wouldn't match up with our digital records. Medical equipment that would mysteriously migrate between rooms overnight. Empty wheelchairs that seemed to move on their own, only to be found in different corners of the ward come morning. I tried to rationalize it. Night shift workers from other floors borrowing equipment, perhaps. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Then I discovered the old records. I was looking for extra supplies in one of the storage rooms when I found a box of patient files from the 1970s. They should have been digitized or destroyed years ago, but there they were, yellowed and forgotten. Most were routine cases, but one file caught my attention. A former nurse named Sarah Chen had documented suspicious deaths in this same wing. Patients who were stable one night and inexplicably dead the next morning. The similarities to recent events were impossible to ignore. In the past month alone, we'd lost 3 patients under mysterious circumstances. All had been stable, all had died between 2 and 4 a.m., and all had shown signs of organ failure with no clear medical explanation. Just like the cases from the 1970s. The official causes of death were listed as natural causes, but something felt terribly wrong. I started digging deeper, spending my breaks in the hospital's security office reviewing footage from our wing. The night guard, Tom, thought I was crazy at first, but he eventually started helping me look through the tapes. We noticed strange patterns, shadows moving against the light, doors opening and closing on their own, and most disturbing of all, occasional glimpses of someone in scrubs walking into patients' rooms during the deadest hours of night. The breakthrough came when I started tracking our medication inventory. Every time a patient died, small amounts of various drugs would go missing. Potassium chloride, insulin, morphine. The amounts were tiny enough to fly under the radar of our automated system, but when you knew what to look for, the pattern was clear. Someone was accessing our medicine cabinets and administering lethal combinations to patients. Last week, everything came to a head. I was working a particularly quiet night when I heard the elevator ding at 3 a.m. Nobody ever used that elevator at night. It was old and unreliable, and most staff stuck to the newer ones at the other end of the wing. I watched as the doors opened to reveal an empty car, but the worn buttons inside were glowing, indicating it had been called from the basement. Following my instincts, I took the stairs down to investigate. The basement housed our morgue and some old storage rooms that hadn't been used in years. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and something else, something chemical and wrong. As I approached the morgue entrance, I noticed light spilling out from under the heavy metal doors. What I found inside still haunts me. Dr. Marcus Reynolds, one of our most respected physicians, was there with his back to me. He was wearing scrubs instead of his usual suit, hunched over one of the examination tables. The surface was covered with vials, syringes, and medical papers. He was so absorbed in his work that he didn't hear me enter. I watched in horror as he meticulously measured liquids from different vials, making notes in a worn leather journal. Next to him was a stack of patient files, all recent deaths from our wing. When I finally found my voice and called out his name, he turned slowly, unsurprised, as if he'd been expecting me all along. "I wondered when someone would figure it out," he said calmly, closing his journal. "You're more observant than Sarah was." The mention of the nurse from the 1970s sent ice through my veins. He explained, with the detached interest of a researcher, how he'd been perfecting his formulas for decades, testing different combinations of medications to create the perfect, undetectable poison. Each death was an experiment to him, a data point in his twisted research. He believed he was working toward something greater, a way to end life that appeared completely natural, that would revolutionize everything from capital punishment to assisted suicide. The patients were just test subjects to him, their deaths necessary sacrifices for his research. I'd already pressed the silent alarm on my phone when I entered the morgue, and I could hear the distant sound of security approaching. Dr. Reynolds heard it too, but instead of trying to escape, he smiled and reached for one of his vials. "I've always wondered what this particular combination feels like," he said, and before I could stop him, he injected himself. The investigation that followed uncovered the full scope of his crimes. 47 deaths over 3 decades, all disguised as natural causes. His journal contained detailed records of every experiment, every death, meticulously documented with clinical precision. The hospital tried to keep it quiet, but the story eventually broke. Sarah Chen's body was found buried in the hospital's old foundation during the investigation. She'd gotten too close, just as I had. I still work at Oakwood Memorial, but in a different wing now. The old wing has been closed for renovation, though some say it's really to erase the memories of what happened there. Sometimes, when I pass by that section of the building during my night shifts, I think about Dr. Reynolds and his victims. About how the scariest monsters aren't the ones that hide in shadows, but the ones who walk among us in white coats and scrubs, hiding behind respectability and medical degrees. The night shift still feels different, but now I understand why. It's not the building that's wrong, it's the knowledge of what people are capable of in these quiet hours when most of the world is asleep. Every time I check on a patient or dispense medication, I think about how thin the line is between healing and harm, and how easy it is for someone to cross it. The scariest part isn't that it happened, but that somewhere out there, another Dr. Reynolds might be conducting his experiments right now, in another hospital, in another quiet wing, during another long night shift. The smell hit me first, that distinctive mix of mold and stagnant water that seems to permeate every old hospital basement. As the new maintenance supervisor at St. Catherine's Hospital, it was my job to inspect every inch of this sprawling complex, including the long-abandoned lower levels. What I found down there would eventually expose decades of systemic abuse and medical malpractice that the hospital administration had desperately tried to hide. The basement inspection started routinely enough. I was checking the ancient boiler system when I noticed something odd about the wall behind it. The brickwork didn't match the rest of the room, and the mortar looked newer. According to the building plans, there should have been another 20 feet of space behind that wall. Someone had sealed it off, and recently too, probably within the last decade. I brought in a structural engineer to check if the wall was load-bearing. It wasn't. After getting the necessary permits, we began demolition. The bricks came down easily, revealing a narrow corridor that wasn't on any of our blueprints. The air that rushed out was stale and carried an acrid chemical smell that made my eyes water. Even our most senior staff members had no idea this section existed. The corridor led to a series of rooms that looked like they'd been abandoned in a hurry. Papers were scattered everywhere. Old medical equipment lay covered in dust, and filing cabinets had been left partially open. But what caught my attention were the scratches on the inside of the doors, deep gouges in the metal, as if someone had desperately tried to get out. The equipment we found was disturbing. Restraints attached to examination tables, electrical devices that didn't match any standard medical equipment I'd ever seen, syringes and vials of unmarked substances. Everything was decades old, but it had been preserved in the sealed environment. The labels on some of the equipment dated back to the 1980s, when St. Catherine's had operated a now-defunct psychiatric ward. The files told a horrifying story. Dr. Elizabeth Weaver, head of psychiatric research in the 1980s, had been conducting unauthorized experiments on patients. She claimed to be developing new treatments for severe mental illness, but her methods were nothing short of torture. Electric shock therapy at dangerous levels, experimental drug combinations, sensory deprivation experiments that went on for weeks. The patients were mostly people who wouldn't be missed, homeless individuals, addicts, people with severe mental illnesses whose families had abandoned them. Dr. Weaver would falsify their records, claiming they had been transferred or released, while keeping them imprisoned in this underground ward. The screams would have been muffled by the thick walls and the noise of the boiler room. We found the monitoring station where they had observed their victims. The equipment was outdated, but had been sophisticated for its time. Multiple camera feeds, vital sign monitors, and recording equipment. They had documented everything. The tapes were long gone, but we found notebooks filled with detailed observations of how different patients responded to various treatments. The deeper we dug, the worse it got. Dr. Weaver had developed her own pharmaceutical compounds, testing them on patients without any oversight or safety protocols. Many of these drugs were stored in a massive refrigeration unit, now long dead. The spilled contents had eaten through the metal shelving. I don't want to imagine what they did to human tissue. The facility had been entirely self-contained. We found a laundry room, a small kitchen, even sleeping quarters for staff. They could carry out their experiments without ever going upstairs. The sheets in the laundry room were still stained with what looked like blood and other fluids, preserved in the dry underground air for decades. Most disturbing of all was what we found behind the morgue's cold storage units. When we managed to pry open the rusted doors, we discovered they weren't storage units at all, but cells, tiny spaces where patients were kept in isolation. The walls were covered in scratch marks and writing, desperate messages from people who knew they would never see daylight again. The investigation that followed required excavating parts of the basement floor. We found medical waste that had been improperly disposed of, along with human remains. DNA testing would later identify 17 different individuals, but there were likely many more. The hospital administrators from that era were all dead or retired, conveniently unable to answer for their complicity. I spent weeks going through old newspapers, trying to piece together what happened. In 1989, Dr. Weaver had disappeared suddenly, along with several staff members. The official story was that she had taken a position abroad. The psychiatric ward was shut down shortly after, citing budget cuts. No one investigated the missing patients. They were people society had already forgotten. The police investigation is ongoing, but many questions will never be answered. Dr. Weaver's body was found in her home last year, an apparent suicide, just as the investigation was closing in. She left behind journals detailing her experiments, writing until the end about how her work had been misunderstood, how she had been on the verge of breakthroughs that would have revolutionized psychiatric treatment. St. Catherine's is still open, though the basement has been sealed off permanently. Sometimes, when I walk through the hospital at night, I think about all the people who worked here during those years. How many of them heard screams and chose to say nothing? How many looked the other way as patients disappeared? The building is being renovated floor by floor, but no amount of new paint can cover up what happened here. The decontamination process is still ongoing. Every week, we find something new. Another hidden room, another box of records, another piece of equipment that defies explanation. The hazmat teams work methodically, documenting and removing decades of horror. But the real contamination isn't something that can be cleaned up. It's in the knowledge that this happened not in some distant place or time, but right here, under our feet, in a respected medical institution. As the lead transplant coordinator at Metropolitan General Hospital, I thought I'd seen everything. The job requires a strong stomach and an even stronger mind. You're essentially a traffic controller for human organs, making sure each precious donation reaches its recipient in time. But when I started noticing discrepancies in our organ tracking system, I discovered something far more sinister than simple clerical errors. It began with a database anomaly. Donor organs would be logged into our system, but never show up in the National Registry. At first, I assumed it was a software glitch. Our hospital had recently upgraded its tracking system, and bugs were expected. But when I cross-referenced our local records with the transportation logs, the numbers didn't add up. Organs were arriving at our facility and simply vanishing. I started monitoring our loading dock during the graveyard shift. Legitimate organ deliveries always came through here, accompanied by strict protocols and paperwork. But I noticed additional deliveries happening between 2 and 4 a.m., unmarked vans dropping off medical transport containers with no documentation. The security cameras in this area would mysteriously go offline during these deliveries. Our storage facilities were state-of-the-art, with separate units maintaining perfect preservation conditions for different types of organs. Each unit had a digital log of access times and temperature readings. When I gained access to these logs, I found entries that had been manually deleted, times when the storage units had been accessed off schedule, temperatures temporarily adjusted. Working with Jake from IT, I discovered that someone had created a shadow system within our network. Certain organs were being tracked on a separate database, hidden behind layers of encryption. Jake managed to crack into it, and what we found was shocking. A parallel transplant program operating alongside our legitimate one, complete with its own list of recipients. These organs weren't going to people on the official transplant waiting list. Instead, they were being directed to a private wing of the hospital, a luxury facility that catered to wealthy international patients. People who didn't want to wait years for a matching organ, who were willing to pay whatever it took to jump the line. The deeper I investigated, the more horrifying the operation became. The missing organs weren't just from registered donors. Some were being harvested from patients who had been declared brain dead under suspicious circumstances. Poor patients, undocumented immigrants, people without families to ask questions. Their deaths were being orchestrated to supply organs to the highest bidders. The financial trail was cleverly hidden in the hospital's billing system. Millions of dollars flowing through a network of shell companies and offshore accounts. Each organ had a price tag, hearts going for up to $2 million, livers for $1.5 million. The profits were being split between hospital executives, surgeons, and a network of international organ brokers. Dr. Harrison, our chief of transplant surgery, was at the center of it all. He had built a reputation as a miracle worker, known for finding perfect organ matches when other hospitals couldn't. Now I understood why. He had access to an illegal organ inventory that gave him options no other surgeon had. I gathered evidence through the hospital's old pneumatic tube system, a network of tubes originally used to transport documents between departments. It was the only communication method I trusted, as the email system was being monitored. Jake would send me data dumps, and I would transmit documents to a trusted journalist contact. The evidence was damning. Falsified death certificates, manipulated brain death diagnoses, forged consent forms, lists of wealthy recipients with their organ preferences and price points. Some patients had even requested specific physical characteristics in their donors, treating human organs like custom-ordered parts. The hospital's head of security, Mark Torres, caught us accessing the surveillance footage. But instead of turning us in, he showed us more evidence. He'd been keeping his own records of suspicious activities, unauthorized access to restricted areas, unusual patient transfers, staff members who disappeared after asking too many questions. We took our evidence to the hospital board, but the corruption went higher than we imagined. Board members were receiving kickbacks to look the other way. One board member actually threatened us, suggesting that accidents happened all the time in hospitals. The message was clear: stay quiet or become another mysterious brain death case. The FBI raid happened during an early morning transplant operation. They found everything: the secret donor lists, the offshore accounts, the modified medical records. Dr. Harrison was arrested in the middle of surgery. The patient on the table was a Saudi oil executive. The heart he was about to receive had been harvested from a homeless man who had been deliberately overdosed with medication. The trial exposed the largest organ trafficking ring ever discovered in North America. 32 hospital employees were indicted, including 3 board members. The wealthy recipients who had knowingly participated in the scheme faced charges in their own countries. The hospital's reputation was destroyed, but more importantly, the truth about their victims was finally revealed. I still work in transplant coordination, but at a different hospital now. The experience changed how I view the entire system. Every organ donation is both a tragedy and a miracle. Someone has died so that another might live. Playing God with these decisions, treating human lives as commodities, corrupts something sacred. Sometimes I visit the memorial wall that was built to honor the victims. Each plaque represents someone who died needlessly, their organs harvested to feed the greed of wealthy clients and corrupt doctors. But it also represents something else, a reminder that in the face of systemic evil, ordinary people can still stand up and expose the truth, no matter the cost.